Well, hello again, folks. And as always, I'd like to thank you for tuning in to Crosslights, where we are re-examining the end times. And we are doing so through the lens of my recently published book, The Threshold of Exile, examining New Testament prophecy and eternal destiny. It's available on Amazon as well as Ingram Spark for about $20. And I think you find it a good read. I know that today we are very much becoming and have become a visual learning society, and most people are tend to want to watch things on video or possibly even through an audio broadcast or audio version of a book. But it's a good read, and I'd appreciate it if you'd consider taking a look at it. Also, After the Walls Came Down, I published this book originally in 2011. It's a look at the first 6 chapters of the book of Zechariah, some interesting study in his visions, and some relevant information for our lives as well as the church. And so if you get a chance, you want to take a look at those. They're available on Amazon. In the meantime, let's continue. My name is Marc Paladino, and we've been now on session 34. We're now in session 34 of this study, and we're beginning a study on the book of Revelation in the past week now. And last week we began to just introduce this whole idea of Revelation not so much as a futuristic a prophecy about things that were going to happen way off into the future of John's immediate audience, but in fact there is so much in the book that relates to Jesus is coming very soon and near in John's time. And so we were taking what's called a preteristic or preterist look at this book and trying to see if we can understand how its content deals with things that were in John's immediate future. Well, of course, to understand that or for that to be possible, the book and the visions would have had to have been recorded sometime before the fall of Jerusalem, mainly because in chapter 11 the temple is still standing, just like it is through the rest of the New Testament. And so that would put us somewhere probably in the mid to late 60s AD, because Jerusalem fell in 70. And so we believe, and we'll be looking at this in more detail, but Nero was in power from 54 to 68 AD. And so most scholars who believe the early date, which was actually the dominant or predominant belief prior to maybe a couple hundred years ago, it was understood, even those who believed in a futuristic perspective of Revelation, many actually believed that this was written probably during the reign of Nero. And actually there are even, just to take a little side note here for a minute, I got a couple of notes here, but there are early manuscripts like the Muratorian Canon, which dates to about late in the 2nd century AD, that states that John wrote the Apocalypse prior to Paul completing his letters to the 7 churches. And the Syriac, which is the Aramaic or version of the book of Revelation, or what we call the Peshitta, which was written about the 6th or 7th century AD, give an interesting title statement that John was banished by Nero. The title of these editions read, the revelation which was made by God to John the Evangelist in the Isle of Patmos, to which he was banished by Nero the emperor. So it's kind of an interesting statement there. George Eldon Ladd, who was a prominent expositor of the scriptures and who was had a futuristic perspective on Revelation, still said the problem with the theory, which is the later date theory, is that there is no evidence that during the last decade of the 1st century that there occurred any open and systematic persecution of the church. And so those that teach and believe or assume, which many of you probably have, that Revelation was written sometime in the late 90s, 96, 97, 95, during the reign of Domitian. The problem is this persecution that John refers to in this book, the saints being under this persecution, there's not really any evidence. And I talked earlier about even a letter from Pliny, who had been part of Domitian's court, had written to a later emperor called by the name of Trajan, that he'd never witnessed a Christian trial, and here there was supposed to have been this supposed bloodbath against Christians during that reign. But all of this fits much better with the reign of Nero, which is common knowledge that Nero was just a crazy, man. He persecuted Christians terribly, and we covered much of this earlier on, so I'm not going to reiterate all of that again. But and as I've been saying, if you're just picking this podcast up now, there's so much that you've missed, and I really would love to have you go back. And these episodes run between 30 and 40 minutes. To go back to the beginning and follow through from the beginning, because I do lay a lot of groundwork, which I'd like to have you make sure that you are getting a hold of. It will really greatly help you understand what we're talking about here. But so now we move into the next section that we want to study here in Revelation, in chapter 17 of the book of our book, and that is that as we journey through our theme, Israel's historical location, as on the threshold of exile, that remains a focal point here. It's very important that we retain that the theme of our study here has been understanding that Israel's historical location as being on the threshold of exile really colors our interpretation of the Bible's eschatology. And so now as we approach Revelation, these warnings of the New Testament that we see throughout the New Testament from the lips of Jesus, Paul, Peter, they are now reaching their fulfillment. And hopefully as we go through Revelation, you'll begin to see how that theme is apparent. Israel is, frankly, what it is Israel at this time in history is now entering the period of their final judgments. And the scope of Revelation encompasses not only Jerusalem, but their entire land, the city, the temple, and the whole Mediterranean region. And as we go through this, I want to remind you of something very, very important, is that the word which we often see as translated earth is most often gay. You can spell that G-E-G-A-Y, G-E-H, however in Greek. But it really refers to the land, as also the word oikomene would refer to the Roman Empire, because it is the first century land of Israel and the Roman Empire that really comprised the theater of the conflicts that we see in Revelation. And so it's important that we understand that. Now we're going to consider these alternative uses of Greek words very carefully, with given respect to the context in which they're said, and with respect to biblical authorities that I've studied and looked at to try to understand the language a little better and how it's used in different contexts. And so we're going to be careful to try to be faithful to the text, not just blatantly say, well, this means that automatically, because it doesn't. And I've said this before, I will say it again. Those of us who are not Greek readers, Greek speakers in terms of the original language of the Bible, whether it's Hebrew or Greek, you can't just jump into a concordance and say, oh, it means these four things, therefore I pick that one. You have to see how it's being used. You have to see the context, and you have to be faithful to the context of not only its immediate context, but the larger context of the book and the writer's use of certain words. So it can be very dangerous. That concordance is a great tool, but it can also be very dangerous if we don't know what we're doing. So I like to be very careful about that. Now we're going to say a word, as we do in the book. We talk a little bit about the idea in Revelation about, first we talked here about the location as being the theater, being that first century Israel and the Roman Empire. And then we're going to see this in detail, by the way. I'm just kind of putting out some ideas at the beginning here. But I want to say another word about repetition, that you may notice that there's a degree of repetition, not only in the visions, but even some of my commentary. And for example, each series of judgments has a very similar great concluding disturbance, as we see. So, example, there are the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, which are a very common understanding of the book of Revelation. These are all forms of judgment. Well, in the seals, as the seals are concluded, the seven seals, we see in Revelation 8:5 that it concludes with thunder, flashes of lightning, and earthquake. Then we merge into the trumpet judgments. And in chapter 11 and verse 19, what do we see? Lightning, thunder, earthquake, and a great hailstorm. Then we move to as the trumpets come to their end, the bowl judgments come into view, and we see lightning, thunder, great earthquake, and huge hailstones as the bowl judgments come to a conclusion in chapter 16. And if we were to just simply even compare the trumpet and bowl judgments alone, you might notice that, and this is on, by the way, this is a table that's on page 293 of the book. you'll notice that, for example, that there's a prelude where the Jewish remnant is preserved, both in the trumpet judgments of chapter 7, verse 1, and the bowl judgments of chapter 14, verse 1. Each second judgment in the trumpets and bowls affects the sea, and that would be in chapter 8, verse 7, and chapter 16, verse 2 of the bowls. And I won't go through this in detail again, but in the third judgment affects the rivers, the fourth affects the heavens, the fifth affects people, the sixth affects the Euphrates River, and the seventh describes the end. So these are common images that we see that are basically duplicated. And this is very important, and I'm going to explain to you why. Because the repetition of certain aspects of John's visions is divinely ordained, and it has noteworthy biblical precedents found in two Old Testament stories. The one story is Joseph, the other story is in Daniel. So Genesis and the book of Daniel that are going to give us some interesting precedents that we need to consider. Let's go first to Genesis 41. In the interest of time, I'm just going to tell you the story. It's in Genesis 41. Love to have you read it in your spare time. In Genesis 41, Pharaoh of Egypt dreams of famine throughout his land. And he sees this vision twice. It looks a little different, but it's the same basic vision of 7 years of famine. And Joseph is called on, and we're going to not be able to go into all the story of Joseph here, but Joseph is called on to interpret for him, and he tells him that the duplication of the vision means that it's from God, specifically because the same individual saw this vision twice. Now watch what Joseph's instruction to Pharaoh reads. In Genesis 41 and 32, and the doubling of Pharaoh's dream, Joseph says, means, important word, means. There's a specific definition we're being given here. This means something, all right? It's important for us. The doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God. That means it's going to happen, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, isn't that interesting? Genesis 41:32. The doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will bring it about shortly. All right? So not only is the matter from God, but this replication of the same to the same individual was a sign that what was seen was going to come to pass shortly. Now, what are the implications for Revelation? They must be considered. Many of John's visions, as we said, had these redundancies or parallels. They are seen from slightly different vantage points, just like Pharaoh's dream. And as the table we've just seen on the previous image there, the table shows that John's seeing these same things in two different visions, but they're given to the same person, John. If we take Joseph as a precedent, now consider the fact that Joseph specifically told Pharaoh, this means something, okay? There is a specific meaning in God behind this type of revelation or this type of dream, then we must assume that the repetitions of John's visions would also indicate that his events that he was seeing would occur very soon. Isn't that interesting? Because in Revelation 1:1, what are we reading? The things must come to pass shortly. They're soon to come to pass, which he also says in Revelation 22, the things that must shortly come to pass. And so the repetition of those visions in John's Revelation also fill that same idea that these things are going to happen very soon and that they're from God. And so in John's time, this gives us evidence that the events that John saw were to happen within a very imminent time. Not some 2,000 years away, but right there in John's time. Soon means soon. Shortly means shortly. Quickly means quickly. Okay? We talked about that a bit last time, so I won't go back into it. Now, a second interesting perspective is in the book of Daniel, and it deals with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I'm going to give you my opinion on this because it's slightly different and it doesn't explicitly say what I'm going to suggest, but I think there's enough there for us to go on. that in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, now remember the Jews are in Babylon now, they're in exile, and Nebuchadnezzar has this famous dream of this magnificent statue, and it consists of several metals in sort of a descending order from a head of gold. And of course, Daniel interprets this for him as Nebuchadnezzar is the king, and that he is the head of gold. And then he sees the remaining portions of this statue of silver, of brass, and of iron mixed with miry clay. They represent empires and their kings that are going to follow successively after him over the centuries. But let's bear in mind, take this image. This is a great image of a glorified man, a huge image of a statue of man. But in contrast to Nebuchadnezzar's glorified man, Daniel 7, the prophet dreams the same historical sequence, okay? So what Nebuchadnezzar sees is himself as the head of gold, and then this sequence of empires that will succeed him. Daniel sees the same sequence, only the difference is Daniel sees them for what they really are. They're merely ravenous beasts. He sees, again, he sees Babylon, he sees Persia, he sees Egypt, he sees Rome, but he sees them as ravenous beasts. And so we see what's behind the vision of two different people. Nebuchadnezzar is seeing this glorified man, but Daniel the prophet seeing what's behind, and that's very significant. But first, let's just take this. In Daniel's vision, those visions that he saw would occur long after his time. He was told to seal them because they would pertain to many days in the future in Daniel 8. And then he is also told to seal the book until the time of the end in Daniel 12. And we talked a little bit about this last time, is that here John was told not to seal the visions because the time was at hand. Daniel's visions were 500, 600 years up the road, and he's told to seal them because they had nothing to do with his time. So put that one in your pipe there and smoke it a little bit, because that's a very important distinction. Why would John be told not to seal if his visions were for something 2,000 years down the road, okay? But Daniel's visions were given to two different individuals, which may also indicate that the timing of these things, unlike that of Joseph, would be farther off in the future. Now, that's my opinion on that. It isn't specifically said, but it may indicate that. Now, I think almost more importantly is the spiritual realities that are being made available to us through this vision. In Daniel 7, Daniel is actually seeing the principalities, the demonic principalities that are behind the empires in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Nebuchadnezzar's not capable. He's a natural man. He's not capable of seeing those things. And this is all evident from the fact that Daniel sees the vision of a goat and a ram in chapter 8. This pertains to the historical conflict between Persia and Greece that was to happen as Babylon was passing out of power. Persia and Greece were coming into the scene as world dominant powers. In chapter 10, the angel informs Daniel that the angel, is engaged in spiritual warfare involving princes or principalities of these two nations. Now, those are dominions, are spiritual dominions that are governing over or influencing the powers of these nations. But they are also the two of the beasts in Daniel's vision in chapter 7, okay? And Daniel is told in chapter 8, verse 8, that this one has eyes like a man, which indicates, he's saying it's like a man. It's not a man, it's like a man, which indicates the true essence of this power and this beast that Daniel sees in his vision is not human. And this becomes very, very important as we get into our study of Revelation, and we start seeing beasts and dragons and things. That we're looking not necessarily at people, but the powers that are at work behind these people. And you'll see that this is very vital to the interpretation. Okay? So now, let's take a look at a few other considerations that we need to bear in mind when we're studying Revelation. First, Revelation was communicated to John through symbols. Okay, we're told that in chapter 1, verse 1. That same word is word used by John to describe the signs that Jesus performed, the miracles that he performed. And it means here in Revelation 1 that this was communicated by means of signs and symbols. So we have to be careful. There are some things that should be literally understood. I don't want to throw that out the window, but this is preeminently a book of signs and symbols, that the things that John's seeing are symbolic, okay? They represent other things, and so we have to try to get our arms around that, and most people who read Revelation, I think, see that, and they struggle with it. But we need to understand this about signs and symbols in Revelation. You know, the metaphorical or the symbolic structure of languages, it changes with technology. It changes with the shape of the world or our varying worldviews. We say things I think it was Milton Terry who quoted another author, I believe, but he said that language is really nothing more than a collection of faded metaphors. Our language speaks of our environment and how we see things, and so words are developed and phraseology is developed that seems to convey that. I mean, it's a simple little silly statement, and probably something we used to say more often than we do now. Two cars get in it, you're going to go into a race down the track, and one guy looks at the other and says, I'm going to blow your doors off. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means he's going to beat him like crazy in the race. But what would that mean to Moses or Joshua or Paul? It wouldn't mean anything. My investments went in the tank. What would that mean? That would, of course, if you're an investor, you know exactly what that means. The money you had invested in a certain stock just fell through. It went bad, and the company went bad, and the value of the stock went down. You lost a lot of money. I mean, those are just phrases that would mean nothing to an ancient culture, may mean nothing 500 years or 200 or 300 years from now, but today it has a specific meaning because it's characteristic of our own culture, and so these words employed in any language reflect images of its culture at any given time. However, biblical symbolism is a little different animal. And even though, we have roughly 1,500 years of written content in the book, beginning with Genesis and the Torah, the books written by Moses, right through to the book of Revelation. We have about 1,500 years of a writing period there, but it covers, of course, closer to about 3,500 years of human history. We really have to consider that the Bible is a different type of literature, and its symbols are consistent. Now, you may see through various books as time progresses little twists and turns and variations of meanings in those symbols, but the tabernacle is the tabernacle. The temple is the temple. Idols are idols, and these things didn't really change over the course of biblical history, and so we have to remember that we shouldn't be looking for Revelation to suddenly come up with pictures of skyscrapers or killer bees or helicopters or bomber planes, okay? That's not Revelation's worldview. John is speaking to people. Remember, it was written to the churches in Revelation at that time, and it was meant for them to be understood. And one commentator once said many years ago that it was, if it was not understandable to them, then it was nothing more than a dead letter. And how would they obey the command that this must be read? And blessed is he who reads and obeys and understands the words of this book. What blessedness would it be to them if they couldn't understand that this was the technology was 2 millennia beyond their time? You see, it was written in language and in symbols and in metaphors that they could understand in their day, okay? And so that's so critical for us to understand that. And so its symbols allude to places, events, and structures within their own history and how they are described within the text of Scripture and what their implied meaning is in that Scripture, okay? That's what this is about. And in some cases, it even picks up some ideas from even their Second Temple myths, because those were things that were current, okay, to their world and their worldview. So very important to understand how the symbolism works in Revelation. Secondly, we must become acquainted with time sequence in Revelation. For example, you see quite often, then I saw, John says. Well, that should not be assumed to mean that then this happened, okay? John saw many similar events, as we've already mentioned, the duplication, saw many similar events from different perspectives, so we should not assume that Revelation necessarily is a chapter-by-chapter sequence from chapter 1 to chapter 22. Or even within a specific section of Revelation, it may not be the case. Now, I think there is an apparent general sequence to the visions, and it's moving predominantly toward a fulfilled history. Okay, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. That there is a general sequence that moves toward a conclusion, or what the Greeks call the telos. Okay, a conclusion, a destined conclusion. Now, as we consider this, thirdly, as I have said, my perspective on this is preteristic, or preterist if you concern. And by the way, I want to point out, some of you are familiar with those terms. It brings up a red flag. I don't consider myself necessarily a full preterist. I think there are elements in Revelation that would indicate that that the visions carry on out beyond just the final text there in Revelation. I also want to point out I don't fit classical partial preterism either, and so I have some differences of opinion there. So I'm going to kind of use the word eclectic. Okay, there's things yet that I haven't fully formulated, so I'm giving you some ideas to think about, but I don't have a full-blown system of theology here developed for you. But it is a preteristic perspective, which indicates that I believe that Revelation is predominantly fulfilled history, and I hope to demonstrate that in the course of the next several weeks. Now, with that, the challenge is to determine not only the biblical evidence of its fulfillment, but also to the extent possible to see if there is historical evidence. So much like we did at the Olivet Discourse, we tried to look at the language of the text, and the prophetic language, and how that resembled the Old Testament prophets. We tried to see what we could learn about the historical events. We also tried to understand the context, the literary context. We'll try to do the same thing here with Revelation to see if we can determine not only biblical evidence, but to the extent possible some historical evidence, and use literary the literary context as well. But just as in the Olivet Discourse, the most important evidence is the narrative's own self-witness. And that's really what we want to look at. Are there visions, are there snapshots in Revelation that help us to see that it's giving us its own self-witness as to when these things occurred and how the visions were fulfilled? Now, in many cases, let's be frank, the historical evidence is going to be available, but other times there is going to be an absence of known details. And as I have been trying to tell you along the way here, is that we must build on prior learning, okay? And so once we have established enough evidence that this is a historical event, then if we don't have details historically to say, I know this happened, therefore that must have been past, sometimes those historical details aren't there. But we have to step back and rest in our understanding that because of this literary context, we know that it had to have been then, at that time. So we just have to simply resign ourselves to the fact that it's just something you just had to be there. Not everything is going to be known to us. And as I've said, that the popular speculative interpretations of the futuristic ideas that we often get that's popular today are also difficult to prove. Why? Because they're future. They're speculating or proposing that this is a future event, but they can't necessarily be proven either because they haven't happened yet. And as I've been saying, and a few times I've mentioned, and these things are worthy of repetition, in Revelation 10, John hears 7 great thunders, the meaning of which he is not permitted to disclose. In Revelation 10:4, I heard a voice from heaven saying, seal up the things which the 7 peals of thunder have spoken, and do not write them. Okay, what do we do with that? Well, it just tells us that we don't get to know every detail. For whatever reason, God has them in his own sovereignty, and so we have to just be big enough to understand that we're not going to understand every line of this book any more than we're going to understand every line of Romans or Ephesians, Galatians, or the Gospel of Matthew. And remember also, Paul wrote to the church of Thessalonica about the man of sin, but the data remains a private communication between Paul and the first century church concerning the things he taught while he was with them. He writes in 2 Thessalonians 2, 5 and 6, "Do you not remember that while I was still with you, I was telling you these things, and you know what restrains him," that is the man of sin, "until now," or restrains him now, "so that in his time he will be revealed." Well, obviously the Thessalonians knew precisely who this person was. We weren't given that. Now, I suggested in our earlier discussions that I felt it had to do with the zealot leader. We're not going to go back and retrace that, but I'd love to have you go back and read it. But we don't know for sure. No, and that means that the restrainer, like some believe, is not necessarily the Holy Spirit, or it's all speculative. We don't know for sure. We can only venture to try to understand it in context with the rest of the section that we're reading. And so my point here is that as I provide you with historical details and contextual details that illustrate what I believe to be historical fulfillments in the book of Revelation, somebody's going to come along and say, yeah, but what about this? Okay, when did that happen? Well, I don't always know when that happened. All I know is the context here indicates that this book must have taken place, this revelation must have taken place at a certain time, okay? And we talked about time texts in the past as well, as how those time texts are embedded in a prophecy to tell us, to give us clues as to when it took place. So, our next point, Scripture interprets Scripture, and I have hammered this home more than once, frequently in the book. I'm reading from page 297 in the book. We must evaluate the evidence in the book itself that indicates the time and nature of its characters and events. Having established that, although we may not fully grasp each detail, we can be confident that it must have occurred within the stated parameters given to John by the Holy Spirit. It's especially relevant as we hear the echoes of the prophets of old in many of the texts who prophesied the first destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. And so, external data, can be of value, early Christian writings and things like that, but the internal content of Revelation itself, its allusions and its reference must be given first priority. The book of Revelation contains many images and allusions to prophetic warnings and descriptions related to that event, like the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Marvelous study. Many scholars have noted this. The example of the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, and the book of Revelation. Now, I'm just going to offer you just a scant picture of this, but there is a long list here that I would encourage you to take a look at and research. I go into it I don't go into great depth in the book, but I give you some examples. Ezekiel, the correlation between the prophet Ezekiel and Revelation. Ezekiel was a pre-exilic prophet. Now that means that he prophesied before and actually during the exile of Israel. And so Ezekiel was a prophet during that time to Israel, warning them of the coming pending destruction of their city and their temple by the Babylonians. But I want you to notice I'm going to give you a tick list here, and then we'll look at it in a table. He says that we see a vision of the four creatures before the throne in both visions. Ezekiel speaks of the nearness of the time. Both Ezekiel and John are told to eat the book. Both Ezekiel and John see the sealing of the saints. Both Ezekiel and John see the vine of the land and the river of life. And Ezekiel's prophecy warns what was soon to occur, which was the destruction of Jerusalem in the 6th century BC. Now, you have a table there that you can look at. It's on page 293 of the book. Notice the language. Events will occur shortly, both in Revelation 1 and Ezekiel 7. The righteous are sealed, both in Revelation 7 and Ezekiel 9. The Lord cries out, no more delay, which is in Revelation 10, and Ezekiel 12. Both prophets are called to eat the book, Revelation 10 and Ezekiel 40 to 43. Jerusalem is compared to Sodom in Revelation 11 and in Ezekiel 16. The gathering of the Jewish remnant occurs in Revelation 14 and Ezekiel 34. The vine of the land, which is a reference to Isaiah's Song of the Vineyard from Isaiah 5, occurs as referenced in Revelation 14 and Ezekiel 15. The great harlot is seen in Revelation 17 and 18 and Ezekiel 16 and 23. And the river of life is seen in Revelation 22, 1 to 2, and Ezekiel 47, 1 through 12. You have two prophets, 600 years apart, seeing the same type of visions, using the same language, both in exile. When Ezekiel wrote this, he was among the exiles by the river Kabar, we read in verse 1:1. So he was already among the exiles prior to the actual destruction of the city. They're using the exact same language, and what are they describing? They are describing the invasion, the pending invasion of a foreign army. Ezekiel sees Babylon, John sees the Romans, about to invade the city and destroy the city, and these events are to occur very soon. Matter of fact, so soon that God tells both of them, there will be no longer a delay. The judgments now are going to occur. Powerful parallels here, okay? And these are important distinctions. These are important things that we must see if we're going to interpret the scriptures properly. This is called intertextuality. This is how one writer is using the imagery and vision of another writer to convey a situation that is happening in their own time as well, okay? Now, if Ezekiel was prophesying this, that it was going to happen several thousand years from now or from his time, okay, it's one thing, but he doesn't. He is seeing something. He is right on the threshold, if I may use that word, the threshold of exile in the 6th century BC, as John is seeing Israel on the threshold of exile in the 1st century BC. That's why I'm saying this had to happen before the Romans destroyed the city. It had to be seen and understood before 70 AD. So moving on as we bring this to a close, Revelation 4 and 5, the stage is going to be set. Now, of course, so much could be said here about these glorious visions that John sees. And in the book, some would criticize me for not going into great detail. I didn't write the book to give a line-by-line explanation of the book of Revelation. I'm trying to help the reader see, the listener now see, why I think this is a 1st century reality. And I rely on other godly expositors to take hold of this, as many already have in their own right, to give us understanding of its 1st century meanings. But in Revelation 4:1, after the visions of the churches and the messages to the churches, after these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven, John says, and the first voice which I heard, like the sound of the trumpet, speaking with me, said, so this is Jesus speaking again. He says, come up here, and I'll show you what must take place after these things. Revelation 4:1. Now, as we pass from the initial visions, upon seeing the doorway in heaven, the apostle is bidden by a voice to come up here. That's not the rapture. I don't know how that can possibly be referred. Some would think of this as the rapture. John is being called up to see his revelation from a heavenly perspective. Okay, just like the prophets were taken up and saw visions in the heavens, so John was taken up to see visions in the heavens. He opens the door, reveals a throne in heaven, and God's glory radiates with unfathomable brilliance. What a vision that must have been. This enthroned one is encircled by a great rainbow. The great angelic creatures and heavenly visions, or heavenly elders, fill the room. In the center of this great throne room vision is the crucified one, and he is seen as a slaughtered lamb. Our translators are trying to be kind to us when they tell us that I saw a lamb as having been slain. The word there is slaughtered. And if you read the book of Leviticus, you'll get an idea what it meant to slaughter a lamb, being gutted wide open with its innards hanging out. He sees this vision, not of a lamb slain, a little lamb with a little cut on his tummy. He sees a vision of a slaughtered lamb in the midst of all this glory. And to take a little side note here, to me that says the victim is the conqueror in God's kingdom. You know, he turns everything upside down. It's not the high and the mighty, but it's the victim who is the conqueror. Here he sees this slaughtered lamb in the center of God's throne as a reminder of what it took to bring about this access to the divine glory of God for us. And there in the center of the chamber, we see this candlestick-like presence of the Holy Spirit, and surrounded by multitudes of the redeemed worshiping unceasingly. What a vision. What a powerful vision of seeing this Lamb in the center of the throne. And that tells us, church, that the victim is the conqueror. It's not the high and the mighty. It's the victim who is the conqueror. Jesus conquers all through his death. Okay, he could have taken control of the earth. He could have crumbled it up like a ball of aluminum foil, but he chose to be slaughtered that we might enter the glory of God. And then finally in Revelation 5, there's great joy because the Lamb who has been slaughtered also now is made worthy to open the seals. The sealed book, I believe actually that was the sealed book of Daniel. The visions that Daniel was told to seal up, because as they're opened up, we will begin to see, as Revelation is unveiled, many similarities to what Daniel saw. There's going to be a lot of connection, a lot of intertextual references between John's visions and what Daniel saw. But the Lamb alone is the one who is worthy. And there is great rejoicing over that. So now, as we bring this to a close, church, what we're going to see is an age characterized by law, all the physical accoutrements of the temple with its outward ritual observances, the favored city. It's all about to come to an end. 1,400 years, 1,500 years of Israelite history and privilege is about to come crashing down. See, the cross demonstrably put an end to the benefit that they had once provided. But now they've got to be removed. They've fulfilled their purpose. And so this whole revelation is now taking us to the commencement of a new age about to be birthed, but not without great pain, judgment, and tribulation, as Jesus spoke about in Matthew 24 and the parallels on the Olivet Discourse. The sealed book's about to be opened. The fearful judgments are about to commence. And all that can happen there in heaven is the saints cry holy. Because worthy is the Lamb. It's the day of the Lord. And that's about what we're about to look at in Revelation. The day of the Lord, when he comes to bring in a new age. The age that the Jews long expected, called the Olam Haba. Well, anyway, we'll call that a session. I hope you gained from that. And stick with us. Give us a chance. I know futurism is a popular and enticing way to look at this book, but there is so much to be understood if we see this in its historical setting. God bless you, and thank you for tuning in. Hope to see you next time.